You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where Emily and we read the Bible, we talk about it, sometimes make jokes, we rely on the mercy of God and hope that He has a sense of humor.
I think He does. I mean, I've seen the platypus and a few other disturbing things in nature.
Yeah, we watched an ocean documentary recently, and that was weird.
Ocean critters are the strangest. I don't even know. And you don't get to see them. I mean, like, they're the least seen and they're the most bizarre. So grotesque, I think, is the right word for most of them.
Yeah, there's it was an interesting documentary. It's called Puff. I think it's on Netflix. Follows a pufferfish.
Okay. Not Puff the Magic Dragon.
No, Puff the confused looking pufferfish. Because they always kind of look a little confused.
So don't they all look confused? So
but no, they're good creatures, I guess. I had a friend who had one once.
Okay. I don't know what I'd think about having one of those pets. I like pets you can interact with, not ones that, might poison you accidentally.
Well, his was in an aquarium, and he fed him snails, and it was interesting because they have beaks that they have to wear down, so they have to eat shelled things.
Okay.
And whenever he would eat the snails, you could hear it click.
Crunch.
You could hear him like crunching on the snails from the aquarium.
Yeah, but you can't snuggle with those, so that's
No, you can't. And then I know the story's getting a little too long already, but one time he tried to feed him a crab, and the crab found a safe place where the pufferfish couldn't get to inside of the aquarium stuff, like his like fake rocks and stuff. And so the crab just like lived the rest of his life under the rock and like scuttling out to grab food every now and again. And it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, see, that's just not even... I'll take a dog or a cat. We're good. Anyhow.
But, that's beside the point. We are back in the studio after a week off because we had planned to get together for Christmas, and then that didn't come to fruition. Then we were going to get together for New Year's. That's not going to happen now because of weather. Apparently, winter is scheduled for Saturday in Oklahoma.
It might last 2 days.
That's generally how it goes here, but that's fine. So January 1st, we plan to go nowhere and do mostly nothing.
Oh, that sounds about right. I think we're working in the yard. One of the joys of having a yard finally.
Mm-hmm.
We've been doing a lot of yard work, and it's fun. So we've been taking advantage of the warm weather, and I've been picking moss and transplanting it, and it's good.
Best of luck. Best of luck.
Yeah. So anyway, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 20. Last week we got through verse 3. We really didn't, or last time we recorded, didn't get that far because there's just a lot of stuff that went into the background, and basically David has replaced Joab as his commander. Amasa, who was formerly Absalom's general, is now in charge of David's troops. And right on the heels of Absalom's revolt, we have this guy named Shiva who said, hey, we have no portion with David. And we talked about how that related back to that Deuteronomy 32, verse 89, that same language. We find it in some other verses. And basically, this guy is saying, let's return back to the time of the judges. Let's go back to when we ruled ourselves. I think if we were going to compare this to kind of politics that we could understand today, maybe kind of anarchy. We're all protecting ourselves. We're all doing our own thing. There is no cohesive unit. And we really got a sense of how precarious David's position in Israel as a king is. Mm-hmm. And we talked about how we need to remember the time of the judges was not that long ago, and we need to remember how judges ended and how the violence and the gore and just the violence against women in particular was something that marked that time. And so there's some really interesting parallels there that we got to talk about, and that's important as we move forward because we're going to encounter another woman shortly in the story, and she's also going to be one of these women who is going to shape David's reign and rule, and she's going to play a major part, and she's also caused some really interesting questions that we haven't been able to answer until archaeology. And so there's been some debate among scholars, but archaeologists have answered some questions for us. So we're going to get into that, but we got to get there first. So we're going to pick up in verse 4. And this is David. He's talking to Amasa. And this is the first recorded command we have him giving Amasa as his new general. And it says, "And the king said to Amasa, 'Call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days, and be here yourself.' So Amasa went to summon Judah, and he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed to him." So we don't start off with a good with anything good. Basically, David gives Amasa this command. He says, go to Judah, which was appropriate because remember, Amasa is Joab's cousin. He's David's nephew, just like Joab. So he's part of the family. He's from the tribe of Judah. For him to go to Judah to gather them would have been um, totally appropriate, and they should have responded. And he manages to do the first part. He manages to gather the men of Judah, but he doesn't make it at the third day. He misses that window. And we're not told how or why he was delayed. The scripture doesn't give that. Evidently, the writer Samuel didn't think that that was important. We just need to know whatever it is, Amasa did not respect David's command well enough to be where he was supposed to be. And this is a problem. So, of course, the rabbis, they've got to give us an explanation.
Of course.
They they don't like these gaps in the story. So this actually, I don't even know if that's true. They may really like the gaps in the story because it gives them this window to fill in with these wonderful tales and to really influence how these particular people would be perceived in Judaism above and beyond the story as it's presented. So they say that some of the commanders in Amasa's army, or some of them that he was sent to summon, were actually engaged in Torah study. And because it's Torah study, he could not he could not disturb that. So he had to wait for them to complete their studies, and once they were completed, then he could summon them. And so this actually demonstrates that Amasa had a great love for the Torah. Now, I don't.
I think it's funny that almost every time there's a problem or a gap, it's always insert Torah study. If if you need a reason, Torah study.
Right. Well, this is what you're supposed to go back to in Judaism. Everything's supposed to be revolving around Torah study of commentary on Torah, the study of stories and folklore around Torah. So you do all this, and I think this is one of the interesting things. I don't mean to go off on this rabbit trail, but why not? Christians
Sure.
have a really bad taste in their mouth a lot of times for these extraneous accounts and these random stories that are included. What you need to remember is these types of stories were actually told with a purpose. That the purpose is to always point you back to Torah. Why do you remember to study Torah? Because everybody in the Bible did it. Every story goes back to that in the Bible if you take these extra, additions into account. So that way you aren't getting lost and distracted by the action and the violence and the gore of David's rule and reign. You're remembering, oh, my purpose and my goal as a good follower of Torah is to always study. We need to study constantly. So that's the reason for that. And we use stories even in our own culture today to do this sort of thing. We can look at fairy tales. I think we're all very familiar with those. the purpose and the goal is to train children to obey, is to instill the sense of fear that you don't cross these certain lines. You don't go into the forest. You don't, interact with strangers.
Yeah.
Eh,
Like Dwight Schrute, learn your rules. Better learn your rules.
w- well, and that's the thing. I mean, if you have these stories to back up what you're doing, then all of a sudden you can hang on to it. Your mind, your brain is wired. It's hardwired to retain stories instead of just list of facts. So that's one of the reasons why I like to bring the stories up, is because they're interesting and they even help us, even if we don't agree with them or we think they're kind of silly or pointless. They kind of make us think about the text in a little different manner. But so whether or not Amos's delay was justified is kind of beside the point. Some, I think it was Zamora who said that it was possible that basically Amasa felt like once he had the generals, he didn't need to report back to David. He felt like he could just go fight. And so if he um, didn't need David's support, he didn't need David's what's the word I'm looking, approval for what he was doing. He just wanted to go out and take matters into his own hands. So once again, we have this blatant disrespect for what the king has ordered him to do, and that's a problem. We don't want that. We want a general who's going to obey the king. So David realizes that this is an issue, and in verse 6 he says to Abishai, "Now Sheba the son of Bichri will do us more harm than Absalom. Take your lord's servants and pursue him, lest he get himself to a fortified city and escape from us." Now, David immediately turns to Abishai. Now, Abishai, we need to remember, is another one of the sons of Zeruiah. This is Joab's brother. And so David, in a time of trouble, he reverts to doing what he normally does, which is he counts on these sons of Zeruiah. We don't know exactly how long they were with David. We do know that they were with David going back to that time when he was fleeing from Saul in the hill country. So not only are they David's nephews, but they're also his brothers in arms, and there is that real sense of dependence. And it's really interesting that David's instinct, even though he's been mad at Joab, even though he has been frustrated with Abishai so many times, his first instinct is to turn around and rely on them once again. And so, because we remember, for those of you who may have slept since the last podcast, twice Abishai has been the guy who said, "Hey, let's just kill him. Let's kill Saul. Let's kill Shimei." And
Mhm.
twice he wanted to kill Shimei, and David's like, "No, you guys, you always want to kill someone. What's wrong with you? Quit trying." Basically, he says this is not the way we handle things. And it is interesting that David considers Sheba to be more of a threat than Absalom. And it could be that Sheba is capitalizing on the rift between Judah and other tribes, because Sheba is not from Judah. He's a Benjaminite. And so he could be just really trying to divide that wedge further. David can already see how the kingdom is starting to fracture along those tribal lines, with Judah being on one side and the other 10 tribes on the other. And the also could be that the propaganda appealing to individual autonomy and the idea that it's better to rule yourself than to submit to a king.
Mhm.
That's got a certain appeal that even replacing David with a new king just didn't carry. Because I think people overall tend to think I'd rather do what I want to do. I don't necessarily want somebody bossing me around.
Right.
No, yeah. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting question about why David was scared of him more so than Absalom. And it could be too that David thought that Absalom, as his son, on some level would at least carry forward the tradition. And Absalom, there's even the slight possibility that he could have been the fulfillment of the prophecy that God was going to adopt one of David's sons. Remember, we don't have a name for the son that's going to be adopted back in chapter 7. We just know that one of David's sons. So David may have seen it, well, this is how God's going to fulfill that. And, obviously Sheba's totally outside the covenant. He doesn't belong to these promises that God has made to David. So there's a good possibility that David just really doesn't know how to respond to Shiva as opposed to Absalom. So then we have another question that is proposed by the Hebrew, and this is where having that little bit of Hebrew behind the reading helps,
Hmm.
because the Hebrew is very ambiguous. Because David tells Abishai, "Take your Lord's servants." Now, when he's speaking to Abishai, who is Abishai's Lord? Now, one reading is that this is David's referring to himself in the third person, which would not be uncommon with royalty. Take your Lord's servants, take my servants, do what needs to be done. And he could be talking about the warriors already present in Jerusalem. However, he could be referring to Joab, because the armies answered directly to Joab up until Amasa replaced him. And the Hebrew doesn't really tell us in this verse, but it does set that question in your mind. How do we answer this? And I think we have to keep reading to answer it. But David's fear of Shiva is that he's going to make it to a fortified city, and that's going to be very telling. And the Hebrew itself at the end of this verse it's Samuel. We haven't had a major textual problem in a while. Here it is. We don't know what it is. Basically, the connotation from the context is that he's going to escape from us, but basically he's going to disappear from our eyes. He's going to cover our eyes. He's going to give us the slip, is what it amounts to.
Okay.
And so I I think it's really interesting that you do get this picture that baffles translators. I think that's one of the things that we have a lot of academics working in the Hebrew translations who are these very linear thinkers who really get the syntax and all of that sort of thing. And sometimes the imagery messes with their heads, where sometimes I come at it as an artist where I do work with images, and it's like, no, of course the image makes total sense. You have to think abstractly, because the Hebrew language is not a scientific language. It is a language of faith. And in faith there are these doubts, there's these gaps, there's these little holes that need to be filled in, and you kind of have to just flow with it and let yourself be taken by the language in the direction that the context and the total narrative takes you, rather than pulling out these little sound bites. And it's much easier to pull sound bites out of Greek, which gives you very precise terms, very precise linear uses of the
Hmm.
words, as opposed to the Hebrew, where you have these big, broad brushstrokes. I mean, I think if you had to compare the two in artistic terms, Hebrew is more of a Monet, or we got the impressionistic kind of styling, where with Greek you're looking more at an etching. It's the
Yeah.
more precise kind of thing. So it's a difference in the way of thinking, and that's what a lot of people, when they're looking at Bible translations, don't realize. The languages reflect two different mindsets, completely different mindsets. And so you really have to make that switch whenever you're dealing with the two languages. But anyway, the the big thing is the ambiguity and the imprecision in David's speech is really telling, because David is willing to backtrack here. He's still in this state of not quite panic, but you can see his desperation. He's not being the careful, thought out David that we're used to.
Hmm.
He's very much. I mean, his sons just rebelled. His wives have just been attacked by Absalom. Now we've got this new threat on the horizon. He's lost his right hand man. It- his son is dead. He is really not in a great place to be making these calls. I mean, we tell people, in counseling, don't make any major decisions for 6 months after a terrific or horrific life event. After a death or a divorce, hold off. Take your
Right.
time. David doesn't have that luxury because he's king. And I think it shows. So, verse 7, and there went out after him Joab's men and the Cherothites and the um, again, my writing gets me the best. Okay, the Cherothites and the Pelahthytes and the mighty men, and they went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. Now, this verse supports the idea that the Lord in the previous verse referred to Joab, not David. As the men who Abishai leads out are specifically called Joab's men. And presumably these are the men that Joab threatened David with. Remember when Absalom died and David was taken over with grief and he was bemoaning the death of Absalom. Joab basically said, if you don't get it together and act like a king, you're not going to have an army.
Right.
So, so this seems to be the same guys that Joab had commanded such respect from that he could take the army away from David. Now, we met the Cherothites and the Pelahthytes before, and this is in 2 Samuel 8:18. And, there's been some debate among scholars about who these guys are. Most of them now agree that they are foreigners. They were probably Cretans who immigrated along with the sea people. Remember, the Philistines were the sea people who came over. We talked about that before. And David seems to have hired these guys as his personal bodyguards. Now, the wisdom in this is they don't have tribal loyalties. They don't have tribal allegiances. So even if tribes decide to fall away from David, or there's a split within the tribe, within the nation, they are not going to be swayed by politics. These guys only have one motive and one motivation, that's money.
Mhm.
And so if you can keep paying them more than everyone else, you have their loyalty. And this is a very shrewd move on David's part not to have other Israelites as bodyguards. I mean, we've already seen Israelites get swayed. I mean, look at Ahithophel. I
Mhm.
mean, he completely deserted David because he didn't agree with David's politics. These guys don't care about politics. They just want to know, are they going to get paid? And the fact that David would release them into general battle actually tells you the depth of his desperation. Why isn't he keeping his personal bodyguard with them? Why is he sending them out to fight this threat to the nation? It only makes sense if David's really desperate and he wants to pad the number of troops as much as possible. Otherwise, you keep your bodyguards with you.
Mhm.
So, verse 8 says, when they were at the great stone that was at Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath, fastened on his thigh. As he went forward, it fell out. Okay. Anytime you get this much detail, there's a reason.
Yeah, I was
Eh,
wondering about that because it seems like a little bit odd that a sword would just fall out of a sheath.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You don't typically have a sword that's going to fall out of the sheath. You don't take a warrior like Joab, who is so experienced. He's not going to accidentally put it on wrong. He's probably been strapping a sword to his side since he was a boy,
Mhm.
and he does it in his sleep. He doesn't need to think about it, and so there's a lot of stuff going on here. So we're going to start. We're just going to kind of take it apart at the beginning. So the location is someplace we're already familiar with. Back in 1 Samuel 14, this is the place, the Stone of Gibeon is where the men gorged themselves after Saul's vow. Remember, he said, whoever ate is going to die, and it turned out to be Jonathan. But after they won the battle, the men were so hungry that they were eating the blood. And so Saul had to be corrected by the priest and be told, hey, this has got to come to an end. We can't let our armies defy God's word this way. So we need to put something in place to fix this. And so Saul set a big stone so the animals could be slaughtered on the stone, presumably so that when they were slaughtered, the blood could be drained from the carcass, and then it would be okay to eat under Torah law. So it's very possible that this is actually the same stone. We aren't sure, but that there's a good possibility because evidently the stone had some significance, and that would have been a significant event in the history of Israel. Now, 2 Samuel 2, we're right back at Gibeon. We don't have a mention of the stone, but this is the place where Saul and David's armies faced off over the pool, and they were having the debate. And
Mhm.
then remember, Abner and Joab faced off, and Abishai and Joab's brother had chased Abner, and Abner had killed him. And of course, this led to Joab killing Abner, and much to David's dismay, and was kind of showing the beginning of some friction between the two of those. And so we're supposed to expect something violent, something bloody, something that's not quite right to happen here, because the two times we've had it mentioned before in the book of Samuel, good things have not happened. So Amos is here. And again, he's not with David. He was supposed to be with David. We aren't told why, and we've already talked about, what in the world's going on. But the surprise moment really is that Joab's here. All of a sudden, Joab, who has been removed from his position as David's general, shows up. He's not leading the troops, but he's not going to stay at home. He's not that kind of guy. If Israel's in trouble, if David has a need, Joab's going to be there. And he's also not going to accept being replaced by someone else without a fight. We've already saw that, because one of the reasons he may have killed Abner was not just because Abner killed his brother, but because Abner was Joab's counterpart in Saul's army to Joab in David's army.
Mhm.
So Joab's going to keep his position. Now, we get this very detailed account of what Joab is wearing. In the ESV, it says it's a soldier's garment. Alter says it's a battle garment. Art Scroll also has battle garment. Zamora calls it military attire, because Zamora is a little proper sometimes. Bergen calls it a military tunic. So the main thing is, all of them agree this is specifically something that a soldier wears. This is what you're going to wear into battle. But it's not a commander's robe. It's not a general's robe. This is something different. And the word itself carries the connotation of it's measured. So we
Mhm.
got to get this idea of a uniform. Um, we see this referred to very often in Leviticus, where it refers to the priest robes. The priest
Mhm.
robes were measured. They all wore the same thing. It's a relatively rare word outside of Leviticus, but it's our first link to another story, which we're going to return to. Uh, Now, the sword is fastened on Joab's thigh, not hung from his waist, and that's typically how a warrior would wear it. It would be hanging from his waist. And so when Joab steps forward, the sword falls out. And most commentators speculate that this was very intentional, that the sword was positioned in such a way that when Joab came forward, oops, it hit the ground. Because what happens next, Joab's going to need his sword, and if he would have drawn his sword, then that would have drawn a lot of attention. Falling to the ground, it happens. Big whoop.
Mhm.
Nobody's thinking anything of it. So, anyway, Joab says in verse 9, "Is it well with you, my brother?" He's talking to Amasa, and Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand. Again, detail. Whenever you get that kind of detail, you got to ask, why is it there?
Mhm.
And he takes Amasa's beard by the right hand and kisses him. Now, again, Amasa and Joab are cousins, so for Joab to actually go to Amasa to greet him, basically say, "Hey, we're putting our differences aside, no ill will, we're good." They This would have been expected. I mean, they probably grew up together.
Right.
They, I mean, even though he was Absalom's general, Amasa was Absalom's general. Absalom was part of David's court for a very long time. Joab was the one who advocated for Absalom to come back. So there wasn't this huge rift for a very long time. And that they functioned as a unit. And I think we need to remember that, because when we get presented with these characters a lot of times, we don't we aren't told about the happy times. We aren't told about how they function together. We're just told, hey, here's the conflict.
Mhm.
So we need to remember there's background here. There's no reason for Amasa to think there's something to be suspicious of. And, he was probably just relieved Joab didn't appear to be holding a grudge at this point.
Right.
Now, yeah. Now, the practice of grabbing the beard is not mentioned anywhere else, but here is kind of presented as an act of affection, which totally makes sense. If anybody's seen pictures of my husband on Facebook or what have you, he's got the long beard, and it's just very natural to grab his beard, and it's just something we do. But it could be that this was this was practiced at the time. I mean, because just to be realistic, when you go to kiss somebody with a big full beard like that, if you don't grab hold of it, sometimes you can wind up with a face full of whiskers, and that's not always the most pleasant. So, but the importance and the significance of grabbing the beard here is he grabbed the beard with his right hand. And so even though we don't have the detail in the next verse of when he picks up the sword, we know he's got to pick up his sword with his left hand.
Right.
So now we have another connection back to the story I said we're going to return to, but we're going to keep going. Amasa 10. But Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand. So Joab struck him in the stomach and spilled his entrails to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. So we've got several details that take us right back to Judges 3,
Mhm.
where got Ehud, the left-handed Benjaminite, and he made a two-edged sword that was fastened where? To his thigh. It was under his clothes. We have that specific mention of, again, that same word for a measured garment. It's the only place it shows up in Judges. He takes this tribute to Eglon, which is a sign of affection and devotion, which is exactly the same attitude that Joab is approaching Amasa with. He takes the sword in the left hand. He strikes Eglon in the belly, and then we're told that wonderful graphic detail that the dung fell out. So we also have connections with Joab and Ehud because they both use shofars. They're one of the few who are specifically said to use shofars in summoning the troops. Now, Joab is from the tribe of Judah. Ehud is from the tribe of Benjamin. And Benjaminites are known for having these left-handed warriors. Remember,
Mhm.
they were supposed to be great warriors. And so it's kind of interesting that Joab is using his left hand to wield his sword. But again, this is probably just a testament to the fact that this is how good Joab is. He can fight, you get that scene in Princess Bride, you left hand, right hand, he can do it all because he's the best warrior aside from possibly David himself. But we've already been seeing David, man, he's just not the warrior he used to be. When they're going into battle against Absalom, you don't bring him into battle with you because we can't count on him to win now. We got to protect him. And we're going to see more evidence as we move forward into the next chapter. But um, anyway, Joab and Ehud both approach, their target under the guise of peace. And the fact that the sword is on their thigh and it's mentioned specifically of both of them, it means that it's concealed under these Hebrew garments, the madeh. And so the strike to the belly with the sword from both comes with the left hand. So each victim, there's a spilling out. With Amasa, his guts, his intestines fall out. With Eglon, of course, his the dung spills out. And so when we have these retellings, we need to once again, and I know we talk about this a lot, but I think this is a new concept for a lot of people reading the Bible, that you see how you're supposed to read each story in light of each other. And I think this story is telling us how we're supposed to view Joab because he's very much in keeping with the character of those judges. He is that product of that culture and that age where your prestige and your value is really based on whether or not you can lead people successfully in war. And we got to remember when we're talking about judges, we aren't talking about somebody who sits behind a bench in long robes and bangs a gavel. We're talking
Hmm.
about these warrior tribal leaders who rose to prominence because they were able to successfully push back an enemy. They were the same kind of warriors that Joab was. And we also need to remember that in that day, violence was how you stopped violence. If
Hmm.
you wanted peace, you met violence with violence. And this is what Joab does time and time again. Anytime there's a problem, there's some kind of, there's some enemy approaching Israel, he leads the army out to push them back so that the land is protected and so that David is protected. And um, you know, Joab is interesting because he does embody so much of the previous age. I mean, in a lot of ways, he's very much a living artifact from that time of the judges. And now I'm not saying there's not going to be violence going forward because we've left the time of the judges, um, but it's not the same. You aren't going to lead Israel anymore just because you're a good warrior. You're going to lead Israel because now you belong to the succession of kings, the dynasty of David, and you don't have a kingdom unless you have a son to fulfill that next role, someone to
Hmm.
take that place. And David really bridges the gaps between these two ages because David still hasn't established the fact that he's going to have a kingdom because he hasn't had a son take the throne yet. I mean, Absalom did for a little bit, but he's dead. David is he's really working towards making Israel into a political entity where politics will guide the future, not just who wins on the battlefield. And so it's really interesting that you see these divisions or these distinctions between the two and how Joab and David side by side really present um, the kind of the leaving behind of the old ways and the beginning of the new ways. And it really provides a really good illustration of the distinction there, I think. So sorry, I got a little distracted. The cat was trying to join me, and there's not a lot of room on these bar stools for a cat and me. So
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now I'm curious, and I don't know if you have anything on this because we have someone being betrayed with a kiss.
Mhm.
We have someone's entrails spilling out. Um, is there a connection here to the passion narrative?
I think there is, and I haven't been able to nail it down as far as like what the theological significance is, because Joab was very loyal to David. Ehud was doing what he was supposed to do,
Hmm.
and then now we have Judas, of course, who the betrayal of Christ. Good grief! I mean, how do you even begin to excuse that? Um, I don't know, and
Well,
other than it was necessary,
well, I mean, I don't think anyone excuses it. I
Mhm.
mean, but I am curious about it because it's like, is this a reversal? What we're seeing here is it a one of the what I can't think of the word for it. Uh where they go undermine the
Subverting.
subverting.
Yes.
That's just a
Well,
subversive retelling. Yeah, that's I'm curious about that because you have it's almost I don't know. It almost seems like a progression. I don't know. I'm confused.
well, I mean, no, there is because when you look at Joab, everything he does, and I wasn't there in my notes yet, but everything he does is in defense of David. He really believes that when he disobeys David, he's actually protecting, he's helping, he's doing the right thing when David doesn't know how to do better himself. And so, and in many times Joab's right. I Abner shouldn't have been part of David's entourage. David shouldn't have been grieving the death of his son. David probably, I mean, politically, yeah, putting Amasa in place of Joab was great, but Joab really is that guy David needs in his life to keep him going down the right path. And so now compare that to Judas' motives. I mean, can we find that playing in anywhere? I mean, does Judas think he knows better than Jesus, or is he just being bought off? And I think that's the big question, because Joab, I think his motives are good, even though his actions might be questionable.
Mhm.
And then,
Mhm.
of course, if you take it back to Ehud, I mean, obviously, um, what he did was right because he killed Eglon, the Moabite king who was oppressing Israel. Now, he's not without criticism either. And if you go back to that episode that we recorded on Ehud, what you find is there's a lot of questions. Why was he taking this tribute to the king? When he stopped to look at the idols, was he worshiping the idols? Was he even presenting the idea that he was worshiping the idols to this Moabite king? And was he wrong in his deception to get that close to Eglon? So there is some criticism on both. And obviously, Joab's not going to come out of this well, because when Solomon takes the throne and David's dying, one of his last commands to Solomon is, be sure and kill Joab. You can't leave him in charge of your armies. You've got to get him out because he has done these terrible things in the past.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
you know, I like Joab. The more I study him, the more I like him, because when I've heard his stories in previous times, before I went into all the detail and what have you, I was always thought he was just kind of this rebel who didn't know how to behave himself. I
Sure.
thought, and now that I'm studying and seeing what he's doing, I really see this guy who has at his heart, he wants David on the throne. That is his one. I mean, he could have taken the army at any point in time. He made that very clear whenever he threatened David. And the story is going to play out, and we're going to see even more evidence that that was precisely, um, well, it was very much a reality.
Mhm.
And and so I think it's really interesting to have Joab, particularly in contrast with Sheba, because Sheba's call is, "Hey, let's go back to the time of Joab. Let's go, I mean, sorry, the time of Judges."
Mhm.
And here
Mhm.
is Joab very much in that vein, that feel and tradition of the Judges, which was what David was opposing. That's why David was anointed king, was to take them out of that, to bring them out of a time when every man was not doing, when take them out of the time when every man was doing what was right in his own eyes. And so it's really kind of interesting that the man who says, "No, we're not going back. We're not going to let even, David accidentally take us back there by doing something wrong," it is this guy who is so much like one of the judges. So it's this kind of weird full circle where we had Israel who first cried out for a king. We need a king. We got to have a king. Everybody else has a king. We need someone to defend us from the Philistines. Now we've had two kings, or
Mhm.
three,
Right.
if you want to count Absalom, and they're saying, "No, we don't want a king." And it was the judges and our last judge, which was Samuel, who opposed the anointing of the king, who warned the nation and said, "No, you don't want him. This is why you don't want a king." And now we have this new judge-like figure in Joab saying, "I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure we keep a king."
Right.
And so it's this really full arc within the story that's just fascinating, I thought. And Joab, I mean, when David replaced him, he could have just packed up and left. He could have said, "I'm done. I'm out of here. You don't want me." But his loyalty and his devotion was such that even if he had to be one of the soldiers just among the masses, he was going to continue to serve David in the army. And so this is one of the reasons why I like him. But verse 10, we're going to pick up on the last little phrase here. It says, "And Joab and Abishai his brother pursued Sheba, son of Bichri, sorry, um, Verse 11, and one of Joab's young men took his stand by Amasa and said, whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. So the writer leaves us with no doubt. This killing of Amasa has made it so that Joab could regain his position. Abishai he just moves over, lets Big Brother step in, and Joab is once again the commander of David's army, despite the fact that he has just killed David's general. And so, I mean, that's huge. You kill the king's general, but you're still going to lead an army on behalf of him. That's major here. That Joab could even. I mean, that's gutsy. I mean, that is so brazen and so bold that when you think about it, it's really kind of mind blowing that anybody has the nerve to try to pull something like this off. And that tells you something about his character.
Yeah.
So
and how much he's respected.
Exactly. Because I mean, the army just falls in behind him, and good grief. If it had been anybody else, he should have been executed. But we're going to talk some about that in a little bit. Verse 12, and Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the highway, and anyone who came by seeing him stopped. And when the men saw that all the people stopped, he carried Amasa off the highway into the field and threw a garment over him. So what's interesting is that Amasa had men with him who witnessed all of this happen. No one was brave enough to treat the body with basic respect. I mean, they didn't cover him with a cloak.
They were probably afraid of what Joab was gonna do. I mean,
Yeah.
seriously.
It's very telling. I mean, and when you read this, it's so easy to just go, oh, well, they didn't move the body. No, you've got to think about what was going on in the minds of the men. And I think you're absolutely right. They were like going, Joab will kill us. We can't even. It is so telling. These little details that we bypass because we read it too quickly. So telling. And so whenever the men
I'd be a little terrified too, personally.
Joab is well, the description.
There's no, I mean, there is a lead up to this, but there's basically no lead up. Joab went from 0 to kill in just a couple seconds here.
Yeah, it's like, you've got what I want. You're in the place I should be. No one's going to get next to the king except for me. I mean, good grief. Like I said, the more I read about him, the more I like him. I mean, he's the friend we all need.
Yeah.
He's the guy who's saying you're out of line. You need to get it together. Act like the person you're supposed to be. By the way, that person you invited into your life is toxic. You need them out. I mean, I really, I think a movie about Joab. I mean, we've got King David movies out there. Why can't we have a movie about Joab? I think that would be amazing. So, anyway.
I thought you were going to say we all need a best friend like Joab. This person's toxic. I will kill them. I mean,
well, maybe.
I think that might be a bit extreme.
Just a touch.
Yeah.
a touch.
A friend that's so close that on your deathbed, you're like, they're going to be totally lost without me. You should probably just
put them out of their misery.
Get rid of them.
Well, and I mean, good grief. He is so fiercely devoted, and I don't think David could have been the king he was without Joab, honestly. I think David needed him. Was he out of line sometimes? Maybe, but I think his heart was always in the right place. So in verse 12, what we find is that not only are they not moving the body, when they see him, they just all kind of stop and stare. They can't even continue on with their following Joab. They have to stop and contemplate what this means. And so Joab's man, the one who had yelled out and said, hey, whoever's with David, follow Joab. Mm-hmm. He has to remove the body from the field. And so the moving of the body kind of did two things. One, it allowed people just to get on with what they needed to do. but it also meant that they didn't accidentally come in contact with the blood of a dead man, and so the way could be cleared ceremonially as well as practically.
Mhm.
And so that comes into play. So, verse 13. When he was taken out of the highway, all the people went after Joab to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. So the writer even tells you, once Amasa is like out of sight, out of mind, everybody just falls into line.
Mhm.
Joab's the guy that they're with. And, and Joab just steps right back into that place of David's commander. And, there's just no hesitation. There's no, wait a minute, what do we do now? It's like, oh, we follow Joab. This is what we do. And I think you've really got to look at what Joab has done. And we've talked about it some, but, he's killed Abner. He killed Absalom. He killed the king's son. He has jumped David's case for not acting like a king. And now he killed David's general. And so the fact that Joab is still alive is kind of even a testament to the affection and the respect that David had for him. Because,
Mhm.
yeah, David orders him to be killed when on his deathbed. But while David is alive, I know it sounded like it was no big deal.
Well,
But
no, the whole scenario is just weird, and it's not something that I've really thought about in depth. I mean, can just thinking, as in my experience, having been a manager in different different businesses,
Mhm.
where it's like you have someone who comes in and they don't like the new hire, so they just kill him. I'm running like these ridiculous scenarios in my head now of how this all.
How would this play out today?
Yeah, it's just like didn't like the new hire,
Yeah.
off with him. It's really
But the fact that David
really
allows
strange.
it just really blows my mind because by all rights, Joab should have been executed a few times over at this point.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, I'm totally with you. I agree. Um,
yeah,
it's very interesting. It's like what is it about him, that really is keeping him safe?
I really do. I think because at some level, David knew everything Joab did was really in service to the king. Everything that Joab did, even in defiance of what David had decreed, was Joab's attempt to protect David from either an outside force that Joab just really, or that David couldn't wrap his brain around because David was being emotional. David was allowing his bonds to this person to cloud his vision. We can even go back to Abner and the fact that Abner was probably in Saul's courts during the day that David was living in Saul's house. And they probably knew each other. And so when Abner approaches David, it's like, oh, yeah, here's a friend. This is somebody I've lived with, I've eaten with, I've traveled with, we've shared all this experience. So if he wants to join me, yeah, I'm going to accept him because it's an old friend,
Mhm.
despite the fact he was on Saul's side. And Joab's going like, no, this doesn't fly. David, he has that tendency, and we've seen this over and over again, to have this misplaced compassion. And we've talked about that specifically with the scenario with Hanun, the son of Akash, and with Mephibosheth, and the contrast and how he dealt with the two of them, or how he dealt with Mephibosheth versus Shimei. And the people who were most loyal to David were often the ones the most at risk. David always he always seems to be reaching for the approval and acceptance of people who are not completely sold out to him. Once
Mhm.
you're sold out to David, once he has your unquestioning loyalty and devotion, he kind of almost seems to be done with you. It's like he won you over, and now he's got to cater to somebody who's just outside his circle of influence. He's got to
Yeah,
bring them in.
yeah.
And so the fact that he does this and Joab's the one going, "No, dude, you can't do this. You've got to hang on to the people who are loyal to you." So I think that David, like I said, on some level, he gets it. He understands it, and he knows he needs it, even if he doesn't like it. Now, that's me speculating. I'm having to read into the text, and that's how I'm making sense of it. So if I'm wrong, okay, fine, I'm wrong. Um, I don't think anybody's going to have an argument that can be supported from the scripture in a different way. I don't know. If you do, by all means, bring it to the table. We'll talk.
Yeah, we're here to learn. That's what we're doing. I mean, if
Absolutely.
we're not doing that, what are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have learned so much in the story, and I never expected to really learn this much studying Joab, because he always seems like just kind of the side character in
Mhm.
Bible study and Sunday school class. And he really is pivotal to the success of David's reign. And so that's what's going to make what happens on David's deathbed that much weirder and harder to make sense of, which we won't do just yet, but we will get there. So anyway,
Fair enough.
we're going to go ahead in verse 14. I just kind of a little intro here because we don't have much time left. But Sheva passed through all the tribes to Abel of Beth Makkah, which and all the Bichrites assembled to follow him. So this is going to be really interesting, because Beth Makkah is a dig now, a current archaeological dig. So it's a legitimate site. It's been excavated. Um, it's on the borders of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. So it's, this place that's just rich with all of this historical significance, and the fact that it's been preserved. And actually, archaeologists, one of the articles that I read said that they owe a debt of gratitude to this woman who's getting ready to show up on the scenes, because if she had not stopped Joab from pursuing Sheva the way she did, that all of these great archaeological treasures would have been lost. And so this one woman from history actually has preserved all of this knowledge for millennia for us to learn from. And I'm like, how cool is that?
Yeah.
I mean, whenever you put it into that kind of context. So this is an important city because it's on the Via Maris, which is the highway to the sea, which is the north-south trade route that goes through Israel. And so if you had any goods to transport, you were going to go through the city, go by the city. It's also at the crossroads of the east-west trade routes. So again, you've got all of these cultures that are coming here. You have some major wealth. And this is one of the reasons why it is such a rich archaeological site, is because you can see the influence of all of these cultures in these various ages. And it was pretty much continuously occupied. There's a couple little breaks, but overall, from the Bronze Age, which we're talking back Abraham and Isaac age, all the way to today. And so these excavations really begin to unravel this next story that we're going into. And it's to me, this is one of those really interesting stories, because there are so few stories in the Old Testament, particularly, where the women play such a pivotal role. And we're going to see that this woman actually manages to change Joab's mind, and that she saves the city, and she helps make sure that David's reign is intact. And she becomes very instrumental in the preservation of the kingdom of Israel. And that's massive.
Mhm.
And yet when we tell her story so often, she kind of ends up being this bit player who, okay, she had this little conversation with Joab, who's also a bit player. But whenever you start looking at the stories in context, you begin to get the sense of just how significant these people were. And I think that's one of the things that we forget. If their stories are in the Bible, they were significant. Their stories were important. And so just because it doesn't make for a great flannel graph or a good Veggie Tales, we need to honor what has been preserved for us, because that's how we're going to learn from it. And we got to quit discounting these stories like I did with Joab, and like we've been tempted to do with this woman who, quite honestly, she's been discounted because scholars haven't known what to do with her. And that's the reason why I want to bring in this archaeological information. And we'll talk more about that on the next episode, because I don't want to get too far into the story and then have to stop. So hopefully that'll get you kind of excited about what we're going to talk about next week.
Sure.
So,
Sure. No, I think it's going to be really interesting, especially, this is a story I'm not real familiar with anyway. So being able to bring that in and see some other sources play off of it. But this seems like a great place to break. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Hit us up next week. Find out what happens. In the meantime, if you have not, hit the subscribe button. Like, share us with a friend, write us a review. All those things help us out, help us spread what we're doing. And hopefully this is intriguing and helpful to everyone out there. If you want to be part of the conversation, ravencreeksc.com is the website, gets you to all of our shows, gets you to show notes, and Raven Creek SC on all the social media gets you connected to us. Send us a message. Sometimes we are a little slow at responding because it is, just a few people doing this. We don't have a staff. We are the...
Who's the other person?
Well, I mean, Raven Creek Social Club all together. But for this show, it's just the two of us. We are the cast and producers and everything. So
many hats.
Yes. So, but yeah, be part of the conversation and let us know if you have any questions, comments, or insights to any of the stuff we're talking about. We'll be glad to hear from you. Until then, I guess we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening and don't forget to join us next week.